I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
So again, this morning we are on lesson 12, the Christian's attitude towards civil government and regular government. And we discussed last week about how the government is ordained of God. The government was not created by man. A lot of people think that a lot of different things, because they don't believe in God at all, were created by man. Whether it was marriage created by man, whether it was government that was created by man, whatever it was, people think, well, since there's no God in their minds, therefore, who was the first one to make government? And in fact, God does exist, and he was the one who ordained government. And the powers that be are ordained of God. And that's why we have to be careful that we recognize that if I want to obey God, I have to obey all of his word. And that includes what he says about government. We're down at point 2, if you have your books with you. The proper attitude towards civil government demands submission and obedience. Bill, you want to get Romans chapter 13, verse 1, and I will get Titus chapter 3 and verse 1.
Okay. Romans 13 and 1?
Yes.
Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God.
Okay. Titus 3 verse 1 says, remind them to be in subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work. What does it mean to be in subjection?
Obey them.
Okay. Obey. It recognizes that there is authority, that there is an authority that we are to be subject to. Remember, in the marriage situation, wives are subject to their husbands. It doesn't mean that they're less important than their husbands. It just means that there is in the family a God-given order to the family. That the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. And so wives are to be in subjection to their husbands. And then when it comes to governments, Christians, all people, are to be subject to their government. That means we must submit to the laws that our government passes. You want to get 1 Peter 2, verse 13, Bill.
1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority.
All right. So, keep your finger there, because we'll get the next verse in a moment. The government passes laws all the time. Do we always like the laws that our government passes?
No.
No. There's a lot of laws that our government passes that we don't like. Whether it comes with taxes, and our government is already telling us that our taxes are about to go up, and it's only natural that our taxes are going to go up. Our government has put us into massive amounts of debt. It had to, because otherwise we would have had a deeper depression with nobody working. Like as far as when you have a almost 15% unemployment rate, you need a little bit of help. That means you need a little bit of spending, but at the end of it, someone's got to pay for it. And so we're going to see tax increases. We won't like it. We're going to say, well, that just takes more money out of my pocket. It means it's harder for me to do all the things I want to do. Well, we live under the government. We pay our taxes. We've discussed that before. But our government also passes other laws. A lot of people don't like the speed limit laws that our government passes. It's 100 kilometers an hour on most of our roads. And so we see a lot of people not traveling 100. In fact, I think I heard this this past week that there was a person on the QEW who was clocked going over, what was it, 200 kilometers an hour? It was ridiculous. There aren't a lot of cars out there, and so someone thought, well, if there are not a lot of cars out here, I can just go as fast as I want. He found out otherwise when the cops pulled him over, and he's going to be charged with stunt racing on roads, and that's a very serious crime in Ontario. We don't like our speed limits. The cops sometimes will give us a little leeway, recognizing that if they pulled over everyone going over 100, that they would just be pulling over everyone all the time, and you would have problems. But there is a limit to how much the cops will let you go over the limit. Some people just don't like those laws. Do we have to obey them? Yes, we do. If we don't, we're going to be fined. If we go very much over the speed limit, we could go to jail. And we are doing wrong if we do not obey our government. Right now, we have been told for the past 2 months that we are not to gather together in groups of larger than 5. That's why we're meeting in my living room this morning, and that's why it's just me and Bill here this morning. Now, hopefully this week, our government is going to loosen some of those restrictions, but we're still not going to be able, very likely, to meet in one place for probably another 2 months. We're going to have to rotate through our building different groups of people. I'll get into that maybe a little later this morning. But people have been grappling with, well, should the church be obeying this? Because God told us to meet, and he did. But he told us to obey our government too. And so we had to consider, why did the government tell us not to meet? Did the government tell us not to meet because they don't want the word of God spread? No, they didn't. Did they tell us not to meet because we were going to be arrested for teaching Christianity, teaching Christ to the people? No, they didn't. What was the reason that they gave? We're under a health crisis. And that the elderly and those who do not have a good immune system are highly susceptible to a highly contagious disease. And since people can have this disease for upwards of 2 weeks and not know it and be able to spread it, we needed to separate ourselves from one another. And so, out of consideration for that, we have obeyed the laws of our land. We can worship online. Now, again, it's not ideal. We are going to try to bring an end to this as quickly as we can, legally as quickly as we can. But we are to obey our government whenever possible, even the laws we don't like. Verse 14 of 1 Peter 2, though, tells us another reason. And Bill, you want to get that?
Okay, 2 and 14. Or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Okay,
so submission and obedience, as we've said, are for another reason. It's because the government is not meant to punish righteous people. They don't typically throw people who don't break the laws in jail. They throw people who break the laws in jail. And they have the right to do that. The governments will typically praise those who follow the rules. Premier on television has constantly been not shy to center out people who have been doing good through this crisis. And he has also not been shy to center out people who are not. And so the government has the authority given by God to punish evildoers. It generally doesn't want to do that. It costs money to put people in jail. It costs money to try people for crimes. They would much rather not do that. But if they didn't punish people for crimes that they committed, then there's not going to be any law, any order. People are just going to do as they want, and then they're going to complain that, well, you allowed that person to get away with a crime, but who are you then to tell me that I can't get away with the same crime? Or I can't get away with another crime. It may not be as bad in our eyes. And so God gave permission for governments to punish evildoers. Therefore, we need to be in submission and obey our government, so we are not among those evildoers, so that we are among those whom the government praises. So that's one thing. A proper attitude towards civil government demands that we recognize that civil authorities are God's ministers. Let's go back to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. We're going to get verses 4 and 6. Romans 13, verses 4 and 6. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Verse 6. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. What is a minister? What is a minister? We often think of it in a religious term, but what is a minister?
Well, someone, it's a title. It's someone who's in charge of something.
Sure, oversees, but serves. But serves. We often talk about public service, or we used to talk about public service. People became members of parliament or members of Congress if you're in the United States because they had a sense of duty. They wanted to serve the public. And so, yes, we can use minister as a title, and we need to be careful that we don't raise people up to positions that they shouldn't be. But a minister is just simply one who serves. When we resist them, that do not disobey God's spiritual laws, we resist an ordinance of God. We resist the law of God. Can we be saved if we decide we're not going to follow the law? God's law? Can we be saved if we do that?
Oh no, we're breaking his law.
Yeah. And so it's not a question of should I obey the government? It's I have to obey the government. It's God's law to obey the government. Only in a situation when when the government just goes against the word of the Lord, should we ever disobey God's law. We're going to get to that in a few minutes, so I'm going to save my thoughts on that for then. But, and here's the but, we need to obey God's law, or we need to obey our government's law if we are to obey God's laws, where they don't conflict. When we submit to them, we are submitting to God's wisdom. Bill, if you're still in 1 Peter 2, you want to get verse 15.
15?
Yes, please.
For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men.
All right. We oftentimes, what is the will of God? The question is, what is the will of God for my life? Just type into your computer, in Google, Bible verses with will of God, and you will find a lot of things in the New Testament. This is the will of God. This is what God wants you to do. People are looking for a secret message from God or a special message from God. He's given us His message. He's given us His will. And part of His will is that we obey the government. We show ourselves to be wise when we obey the government. Not only because, yes, the government's not going to punish us, but we show ourselves the fact that others in the world don't have that respect for the government. and they act as fools. They're the ones who do get in trouble. And so we show ourselves to be wise when we follow the wisdom of God. God's wisdom is always superior to man's wisdom. And so when we obey the Word of God, we are following God's wisdom. So that's two things. The proper attitude towards civil government demands that we look for them for protection and fairness in keeping with the rights of our citizenship. Let's go to Acts 22. Let's go to Acts 22. We're going to use the example of Paul. Verses 25 through 29, Bill. You want to get Acts 22.
Verse 25. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." The commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "But I was actually born a citizen." Therefore, those who are about to examine him immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains.
All right. Paul here is being, there had been a mob that got stirred up because the Jews hated Paul, and those who hated Paul stirred up a mob about Paul brought a Gentile into the temple. And of course he didn't, but that didn't stop a mob from being formed. And of course the Romans, when they see a mob being formed, they're going to put down that mob. And they took Paul, and he looked to be the ringleader of this, and he wasn't, but he looked to be the one that they were all fighting over. And so they took him in, and they were going to beat him. They were going to scourge him and punish him for starting this mob and being the reason that this mob started. And so Paul could have taken the beating, even though he was innocent, but he didn't. He appealed to the government's fairness. Paul was a Roman citizen. There were certain rights that a Roman citizen had of not being scourged, not being punished without a trial. Paul was in Jerusalem. Just because you are a Roman citizen doesn't mean you have that tattooed on your forehead. You actually, you would expect in Jerusalem, well, you're going to be a Jew. And of course, Paul was a Jew as well. And so it was just assumed by this commander that Paul was a Jew. But when Paul appealed for his rights, then the commander backed off because he knew what the law was. And if it got back to Felix, who is the governor at that time, if it got back to Felix that he had scourged a Roman citizen without charge, then, or without even a trial, then the commander was going to get in trouble, because the Romans had the right to a trial, to a fair trial. And so Paul asserted his rights. It is not wrong for us to assert our rights if we have it. We have the right in Canada to a fair trial. We have the right to representation in our courts. Now, it's a little different than in the American system, but we do have that right. We have the right not to speak to the police and give up evidence that would incriminate us. We have a whole set of rights. And just apart from being arrested, we have the freedom of speech, we have the freedom of religion, we have the freedom of association, and there are a lot of other freedoms we have. And so if our government tries to encroach on those rights, we have the right to try to assert our rights in a lawful way. It is not wrong. Now, we cannot assert rights that we do not have. If the government has not given us certain rights, we cannot assert them. If I am not a citizen of Canada, I cannot vote because the government hasn't given me that right. It gives that right to citizens, but it doesn't give that right to non-citizens. And so I can't assert that right. But if I'm a citizen and I have everything the government requires for me to be able to vote, I can assert that I have that right to vote in this country. Paul asserted his rights not to be beaten. I know being beaten is not a fun thing, and Paul didn't enjoy it. So why, if he had the opportunity to get out of being beaten, wouldn't he use that? Later on, Paul is also going to assert his rights. Let's go to chapter 25. Bill, you want to get verses 11 and 12 and then verse 25.
Okay. Verse 11. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus had conferred with his council. He answered, you have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you shall go. And verse 25.
Yeah.
But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him.
There was another right that a Roman citizen had. If they believed that they were being treated unfairly, they could appeal directly to the Caesar, to the king. We have an appeals court in Canada. We go to trial, we get convicted. We have the right to appeal in Ontario to the Court of Appeals. Now, they could turn down our appeal. We have the right to appeal to the Supreme Court. Now, they won't always take our case, but we have the right to appeal to that. Well, in Paul's case, he had been held by that point in chapter 25 for 2 years without charge. A new governor, Festus, had come in, and he tried again to be released. And again, the Romans wouldn't do it. The governor wouldn't do it. He was a coward. He was afraid of the people, that there might be a riot. He was scared for his job. And so he was keeping a Roman without charge. Now, Paul he wasn't being treated exactly like a regular criminal would. He did have certain amenities in this while he was confined, but he could not go out of Caesarea where he was. And so Paul, feeling he wasn't going to get out of prison, appealed to Caesar. He said here, though, if he had done something that was worthy of death, he would not resist the government from putting him to death. In other words, if he was guilty, he would accept his guilt. And that's saying something. If we break the law, we really should own up to the fact that we broke the law. Now, we might go to jail. Yeah, we might go to jail. Paul here said, if I've done something worthy of death, you can kill me. You have the right to do that. He's not going to lie in court and say that he didn't do it when he did. Paul was going to be honest. Are you guilty as charged, or are you not guilty? Some people try to play the courts and say, well, they have to prove that I was guilty. And yes, the courts have to prove that you were guilty. But if you are guilty, you should own up to the fact that you were guilty. But Paul was going to use his rights because Paul wasn't guilty. He's going to use all his rights, and we know the rest of the book of Acts shows his trip to Rome, and history would tell us, secular history would tell us, that Paul, when he appealed to Caesar, was let go. He was released. Now, he was later rearrested and then killed, but he was released on that first trip. And we do know from Scripture that he was, just by the books of 2 Timothy and the book of Titus, because Paul is going to say he left Titus in Crete, and we don't read in the book of Acts he ever was in Crete. So what does that tell us? Paul got out. The book of Acts was written by Luke, and it ended before Paul's trial in Rome. We don't get Paul's trial in Rome, but we do have from Scripture inferences that would tell us he did get out. And secular history would show that as well. So we look for fairness. The Christian proper attitude towards civil government means we should pray for those in authority. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, 1 Timothy chapter 2 at verse 2. Well, my Bible program crashed again. You want to get it?
1 and 2?
Just verse 2.
Oh, okay. Well, speaking of prayers, in verse 1.
Oh, yeah, you can do that again.
Prayers, petitions. First of all, then, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity.
What's the reason Paul gave here for praying for our governments? What did he say?
Well, we got freedom to proclaim our belief in God,
Sure.
teach the gospel, for one thing.
Sure. And so we can lead a godly life, and certainly that would go into it. We don't want to live in countries where they imprison us for being a Christian. We don't want that at all. We don't want to live in a country where they imprison us for teaching the gospel. We're going to do those things, as we'll see in a few moments, despite our government telling us this, because we have to obey God. But it is not wrong to pray for the government. We have been praying for our government for the past 2 months especially, that they use wisdom, that God grants them wisdom to be able to manage this crisis well. Because if they don't manage this crisis well, it's just going to go on and on and on, and our country will eventually not be able to withstand some of the ordinances that our governments have been passing. If this disease goes on to infect 60, 70, 80% of the population, and we all get sick at around the same time, our medical system cannot support that. Our country is about 37 million people. 10% is 3.7 million. Multiply that by 7, and you're into the 20s of millions. Our hospitals are barely able to take maybe 100 people. Toronto is a city of about 3 million people. All of our hospitals combined can't take 70% of the population of Toronto at the same time. And that's why our governments have done what they did, is to try to avoid that situation. Because they know if we get into that situation and people can't go to the hospitals, people can't get the ventilators that they need in very serious situations, they will die. And so think about that. If 70% get it and 1% die, that's 700,000. Sorry, I did that wrong. If 70% get it and 1% die, I'm not going to do the math on that. That's about 200,000, 300,000 people in Canada. Think about that. That's only if 1% die. If 2% or 3% die, as has happened in some countries, the death count can get rather high, rather quickly, and that takes people out of the workforce. That takes people away from families, as far as certain families are going to be disrupted. It's a disaster, and our governments want to avoid that. We need to pray that our governments have wisdom to be able to do the things that they are entrusted on doing. They will be judged for the decisions that they make, not only by the voters of this country, but by God himself. But it is not wrong to pray for our government. In fact, it is right, and we are told to do so. So that's another attitude. The proper attitude towards civil government demands that we respect the office of civil authority. Paul's statement in Acts 23, verses 2 to 5, when he talks about the high priest being the ruler of the people. So it's not enough just to submit to our government. We are to respect our government. Some people do not like the Prime Minister of Canada, the current office holder of the Prime Minister of Canada. Some people don't like the current office holder of the Premiership of Ontario, or if you live in a different province, your premier, if you live in the States, your governor, or the president of the United States. And a lot of people don't respect the leader of the country or the leader of the province, and that's wrong. We may disagree with our leaders, but we need to respect our leaders. If the Prime Minister of Canada stepped into our worship period on Sunday morning, we need to respect the office of the Prime Minister. We don't go up and treat him, we shouldn't treat him any better than we would any other visitor, but we definitely shouldn't treat him any worse than any other visitor. And we better treat him with respect for the office he holds, because he does hold a position that God gave him as far as being the leader of government. I'm not talking God chose our Prime Minister necessarily to be Prime Minister, but I am saying that he established government and we have a leader. And Paul couldn't tell that the high priest was the leader of the people because he didn't act like it. But we are to respect. Paul recognized he needed to respect the leader of the people. We need to respect our leaders even when we disagree with them. And perhaps especially when we disagree with them. And so we have that. The Christian's attitude towards civil government demands as much as compatible with Christ's laws that we submit to the ordinances of men, that foolish men may not class with, I don't know what the word that's a clash, I guess, or classify, that's what it is, may not classify Christians as anarchists or revolutionaries. The gospel turns the world upside down by changing people from evil to righteousness. The gospel does not do so by revolutions of government. That's something to think about. The American Revolution was a rebellion by certain people in high authority to the British government at the time. Was it right for the Americans to rebel? No, it was not. There are some Christians who have a hard time hearing that, some Americans who have a hard time hearing that it was not right for them to rebel against the British government. But they didn't like paying taxes. They didn't like the laws that were passed. They said, we don't have representation in the British Parliament. And they are passing laws that are burdening us. Well, that's true. They had the right to petition the government. They had the right to complain all they wanted. But they did not have the right to rebel. And there were people who left the United States who did not rebel. They came to Canada, generally speaking, and they were the United Empire Loyalists. And people say, well, why wasn't it right to rebel? Because God set up government. Once the government changed, now that there is a new government, you have to submit to that government. So a Christian couldn't be involved in the rebellion, but if governments changed, and governments do, you now have to submit to the new government. George Washington and the rebels won the war against the British and established a new American Republic. And so that's the new government. Then even if the British were the government before, they're not anymore. A treaty had been signed by the British and the Americans that recognized the Americans were independent. So when governments changed, our loyalties to government remain the same, even though it might be a different government. But if we are to teach the gospel, we will not accomplish this as revolutionaries and anarchists. The gospel is what changes people's hearts, not governments. In fact, governments rarely change people's hearts. And so the last attitude that towards civil government demands of a Christian is that God's spiritual laws must have preference over civil authority when they conflict. Let's go to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. This is a verse that is often quoted when it comes to disobeying government. Christians' ability to disobey government. In verses 28 and 29 we read, saying, did we not strictly command you not to teach in his name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine and intend to bring this man's blood on us. But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. But I thought obeying government was obeying God. Except when God's laws tell you to do something and man's law says don't do it. God says, yes, obey government. That's part of God's law. But when government decides to place its nose into areas that God has commanded, we have to obey God rather than men. Here, the council had said, don't preach Jesus. Well, Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Peter couldn't obey that. He couldn't obey that ordinance. He would go and teach Jesus. If a government came along and says, you are not allowed to meet because we don't want churches to meet. Go to China. They do that. We have to obey God rather than men. Accept homosexuality as just an alternate lifestyle, and you must accept homosexuals in your church, your local church. You must accept them in that they are able to do everything that anyone else would be able to do in the local church. We have to obey God rather than men. Homosexuality is condemned by God in Romans chapter 1. And we teach homosexuals. We don't hate them. But we can't accept them in sin because God won't accept them in sin. It's not because of my preference. It's God who tells me. Emperor worship in the book of Revelation was seen all the way throughout. And Christians couldn't bow down and worship the emperor. They couldn't say Caesar is God. They couldn't do any of those things. They have to obey God rather than men. However, we need to be careful in how we apply this. A lot of times people say, they're very quick to say, okay, we have to obey God rather than men, and therefore I'm going to disobey government. The way I always approach this passage is there any other avenue to obey God and obey our government? Because we are commanded to obey our government, we must examine all avenues before we disobey God, before we disobey our government, and seek to obey God. And I have an example. A couple of years back, of course, the U.S. Passed through the Supreme Court ruling that homosexuals had the right to marry and be recognized as married by the country. We disagree. That God defines marriage as between one man and one woman for life, and we disagree with that, and we will not accept that. Now, there was a woman in Kentucky who was, I think, a clerk that was in the marriage office, and she refused to sign marriage certificates for gay couples because she said, I don't believe that that's marriage. And my religious beliefs will not, in good conscience, allow me to do that. Therefore, I'm going to disobey my government and not sign your marriage license. And she went to jail for a period of time for not doing that. And people in the religious circles said, well, they applauded her. We have to obey God rather than men. But I suggest she didn't have to do what she did. There was another option to obey God and the government, and that's leave your job. Sometimes we have to give up our job in order to follow God. She did not have to disobey her government in that sense because she had another way out. She could have left her job, and so that is what she should have done. When it comes to obeying our government, we have to exhaust all avenues before we come along and say it's okay for me to disobey our government because God said obey the government. And that's what we need to do. And so that is the Christian's attitude towards civil government.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord.